Welcome back. And in this segment, we're going to look at the effects of government intervention in market structures that we're taking a look at here. Some of this will be review. Some of this is applying what we've talked about with externalities, public and private goods, and applying it to what we already knew about monopolies and per unit subsidies or per unit taxes, and the impact that it has here. So let's look at antitrust laws for a second. What is an antitrust law? Well, it's essentially trying to prevent a monopoly and from forming and having too much market power. And it also could promote competition in particular situations in which you're trying to encourage other businesses to compete in that space. So a lot of technology and transportation advances that we saw following the Civil War led to the national markets that we have today, and ultimately the international markets that we have today. So, but the idea was we started to see a lot of industries that were quickly consolidating, and we saw this in railroads, we saw this in steel, the meat packing industry, and the list goes on. And so antitrust, the trust busters came in to try and break up these trusts because of the concerns about having too much market power. And then consumers were going to be gouged. And that was the biggest concern. So the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 essentially said every person who shall monopolize shall be deemed guilty of a felony, and essentially really broke up the trusts and said, you've got to compete. You got to compete fairly, and you can't do this anymore. Otherwise, we're going to lock you up. Essentially, the Congress had enough, and so they really broke up these trusts, these monopolies, in that time. And what do we see time and again? In the 1970s, we saw AT&T being broke up, Ma Bell. What did they do? They broke them up into different companies. And what do we see today? Consolidation. It's all coming back together once again. But I would also say it's also stratified because you have new technologies coming in, and those Ma Bell companies probably couldn't compete without the new technologies that are there today. So why is it monopolies create this market failure in terms of what we see here? Well, they're going to, the key ingredient when it comes to the invisible hand is competition. If there is competition, you are going to always be on your best behavior in trying to get your customers, because otherwise they're not going to come back. And what incentive will you have for bringing them back if you don't have competition? They can go to the other guy and they can get a product from them. So competition is really the most important piece. You take that away, and essentially you have a monopoly. And a monopoly is a price taker, or excuse me, a price maker in terms of their market power. But consumers are price takers because they have no power in that particular situation. And versus a free market, they have even less power because in many cases it's an item they have to have, and they're gonna pay a lot more for it as a result of the higher costs being passed along from monopolies to consumers. So this is market failure to the nth degree, and the government needs to get involved in terms of trying to address this. Now, why do we regulate? Well, as we talked about, if there's no competition in the space, consumers are going to pay more. And so this is the concern about prices, but this is also a concern about efficiencies. Monopolies tend not to err on the side of efficiencies, and that tends to be a problem for the consumers. So how do we regulate them then? Well, there's a couple of things you can do. You can use price controls, the idea of price ceilings. You can also use quantity controls in terms of you can only produce so many of them, right? But why would taxes not necessarily work in this space? Well, in that space, if you added taxes and you tax them, essentially you're limiting supply, and that's not going to help them. It's actually that's not going to hurt them. It's actually going to help them because, again, they're arbitrarily cutting their supply to begin with. So imposing a tax on them is just going to encourage them to produce less and charge more. And that's what you're trying to get away from. So that's where a tax essentially wouldn't be beneficial. So if you're looking at a price ceiling in terms of trying to get them to be more competitive in structure, you're looking at one of two options, right? You're either looking at socially optimal or fair return. Now, socially optimal we've talked about is this idea of being allocatively efficient. You're producing where price is equal to marginal cost, and that is the quantity at which you're producing, and that's allocatively efficient, because socially, that is the optimal price at which society would want you to produce and charge. Where you're meeting your marginal cost, that'd be the price that you would charge for people, and that would be fair. So that's what they look at in terms of socially optimal. Now, fair return pricing says, hey, you're breaking even, and if we can produce at a price at which you're meeting your ATC, your average total costs, and breaking even, normal or zero economic profit, then that's a place that the government should establish that price ceiling. So these are the areas, and we'll look at the graph here to try and address this in terms of what we see here in terms of how the government steps in to decide this price ceiling. Now, keep in mind that the firm can produce a socially optimal quantity with economies of scale. They can do that because they're the only firm out there, and that economies of scale is really helping them to drive down costs. So it is better for one firm because of that economies of scale. We know this, right? The question is, where should we get government to price them in a way that doesn't gouge society, right? And that is the concern, because unregulated, that's the price of the market. In a monopoly, and that is really expensive, and not a lot of people are benefiting from that quantity that's being produced. Now, fair return, as we talked about, is where price equals the average total cost, and this covers all of their costs. They're breaking even. That would be a fair return quantity in terms of the pricing and the quantity that's being produced there. You're meeting all of your average total costs. You're in good shape. So that's an option for a price ceiling. The other one is what we call the socially optimal that we talked about. There's no deadweight loss in this model because you're producing where your price or your demand essentially meets your marginal cost. You're able to produce there. But notice there's a problem, and that problem is that you're not meeting your ATC. And so what you see here is a gap between your marginal cost and your average total cost, which means you're underwater. Depending on where AVC is, you could also be closing your doors. And so this is where government needs to, if they're going to impose a price ceiling, then they need to also encourage and provide a subsidy in order to bridge that gap. Otherwise, that natural monopoly is going to go out of business, and you definitely don't want that. As a result of your price ceiling, the company went out of business. Now nobody has any water or electric or whatever. And so that's where you would need to be providing some type of a subsidy. So if the government sets a price ceiling at that socially optimal quantity, again, a subsidy would help bridge that gap, and that's what we see there. Now, shifting cost curves, we kind of talked about this in terms of let's apply this to that idea of subsidies and or per unit taxes versus lump sum taxes. We're going to change fixed costs. The change in fixed costs here is changing ATC and AFC, but it's not going to change the marginal cost because the idea here is a change in the fixed cost is only going to change the average fixed cost and the average total cost, not marginal, because again, that is the additional item that's being produced. Now, a change in variable cost is going to change ATC, AVC, and the marginal cost because that variable is essentially marginal, is that last item produced, and that's your marginal cost. So variable cost changes would affect AVC, ATC, and MC, the marginal cost here. And let's take a look at how this plays out. So we have an AVC and a supply curve, the marginal cost above AVC at its minimum, essentially is our supply curve. And if we're going to impose a per unit tax, what you're going to see here is variable costs are going to increase. The entire curve is going to shift. And both will shift upward or inward, leftward, if you will, leading to an AVC that's higher and a marginal cost that's higher in this particular model. So that is what you see in both of these settings here, in terms of the increase in the marginal cost and the average variable cost as a result of these products. So when you see the per unit tax imposed, marginal cost is increasing here and supply is decreasing. We're going to produce less of it. Why? Because it's more expensive and costing more as a result of the tax. So that's what we see here. So supply is actually dropping in that case. Now, if we looked at a subsidy, which way do you think it's going to go? In a subsidy, you're right. The ABC and the MC for both of these is going to shift rightward or outward. In this case, it's dropping, so it's moving outward and rightward while dropping. Essentially, the cost, because of the subsidy, it is dropping or lowering the amount that a business is paying per unit. So the marginal cost and the average variable cost is dropping as a result of this. So in this case, supply is actually going to increase as a result of the subsidy being applied in this particular setting. So that's what we see here in those terms. So what happens then if the quantity, if the fixed costs are increasing? What happens to the quantity in that particular case? If the fixed costs increase, the quantity is going to stay the same. Remember, as we said, the marginal cost doesn't change as a result of fixed costs. Because of the spreading effect, right? The idea is you're spreading it out over time, and when you have a increase in fixed costs, it's not going to impact the quantity. However, what we see here is a per unit versus lump sum is going to have a difference in terms of what we saw there. The per unit is going to affect the marginal cost, the average variable cost, and the average total cost. So those variable costs are impacting MC, AVC, and ATC in that per unit tax. That's going to affect quantity produced. In a lump sum, it would not. It would not, because it's only affecting AFC, the average fixed cost, and average total cost. What the overall costs are, not the marginal cost. The marginal cost is not going to change in a lump sum. So students always get tripped up on this. A lump sum isn't going to change your marginal cost, because you think about it, you're not dividing it up. It's not per unit where it's being added. It's over the entire quantity that's being produced. So that would affect AFC, the average fixed cost. It would affect ATC, the average total cost, but it's not going to affect marginal cost. And so in this example, it's also, because it's not impacting marginal cost, it's not impacting the quantity that's being produced. So there's no changes in the quantity that's being produced there. That's what we see in the lump sum category. And that leads us to that shifting cost curves, as I mentioned. So important to keep in mind, a change in fixed costs is going to change ATC and AFC, but not marginal cost. Only variable costs would change marginal cost, and that's also going to change the AVC and the average total cost in its entirety. Hope you found this helpful. We will see you back in the fifth and final segment of this unit on inequality in the Lorenz curve. We'll see you over there.